So let's talk about the pensioner who was sentenced to 6 months in prison today for perverting the course of justice because he covered up or tried to cover up the fact that he had been selling mince pies and wine in lockdown from his shooting club. And what have you made of this? I mean, it's striking still that people are still being punished for kind of lockdown breaches, essentially, even if this is sort of only sort of tangentially related. We lost our minds in that period, didn't we? I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, and I mean, on that specific story, there are complexities there, but I do think it is really disconcerting and worrying that nearly 3 years, it will be 3 years in a few months really, since we went into lockdown, we have failed to have an honest and frank conversation about what happened, what went wrong. And many of the issues that we're talking about right now in relation to interest rates and inflation and the cost of living crisis and the way that inequality within society has been both entrenched and further exacerbated are directly, in some of those instances, a consequence of the policies that we took in 2020 and afterwards. And just continuing on that, the way that many pre-existing social trends were accelerated around censorship, around the kind of way in which people were kind of disconnected from one another and increasingly suspicious of one another, and the kind of medicalization of public life. And it is, sad but unsurprising that this is just yet another example of how the consequences of that are still being played out, and nobody wants to be honest about that. It's completely absurd when we had all of the controversy around politics and politicians around cakes and so on, that normal people, ordinary people, are still being punished. So I think a good thing that could have been done after all of the cake controversy is that all of the people that were charged with lockdown fines and so on should have got an amnesty, or if not had that money refunded. So I think it is just deeply sad that this is happening, but just an example of how we're still not really confronting truthfully the craziness really that was the lockdown policies and all of the things around it.
Yeah, Tom, I mean, it's, liberty feels like the thing that's often missing from this discussion.
Yeah.
If you see, I mean, there are news stories every day about the kind of health consequences of lockdown. Even the BBC talking about the record waits to have to see a cancer doctor and things like that. That A&E times have ballooned. The economy is obviously discussed a lot in relation to lockdown, but liberty has been the thing that's not been reckoned with even slightly, it feels like.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think that period in the beginning of the pandemic when effectively our whole sort of liberal tradition was turned on its head, and that you were only able to do things if you're only able to do things if the government effectively said that you were allowed to.
If Matt Hancock said you were allowed to.
Yeah, which as we'll get on to is a strange. It's like people always say about freedom. Who decides what I should be allowed to do? And for some reason that person was Matt Hancock for a long period of time. I mean, he was making and unmaking laws at the strike of a pen. We know all about this, and also just the punitiveness. The £10,000 fines for having a relatively modest amount of people around your house, scrambling drones over the Peak District because people were walking their dogs. And also this kind of thing, it became almost unchecked by even what the letter of the law actually was. I mean, the police had no idea what they were doing. They just felt like they had right on their side. And as we've seen in recent years across other issues, they were just, when they felt like they were doing good, they were being incredibly authoritarian and being applauded in doing so. There was an alarming amount of people who were snitching on their neighbours and who were essentially kind of, again, sort of co-opted into that climate of extreme fear and authoritarianism. But there's very little reckoning with that. I mean, an amnesty, as Inaya said, would be a great place to start, but a kind of recognition that we cannot ever be in a situation in which you effectively can have your liberties stripped from you for an indefinite period. Yeah. Laws of the land made with barely any democratic scrutiny. At a whim and in a moment of panic. And surely that's something that we've got to get past for whatever crises might face us in the future.